The dawn came thin and mean over the high desert of the dry comet, New Mexico territory. It was not a hopeful light. It was the color of a fresh knife cut, a pale, bloody line drawn across the eastern ridge, spilling mercury and lavender into the blackness above. Below, the needlegrass prairie was drowned in a cold, ghostly mist that eddied around the mesquite and clung to the sage. The air was so still it felt solid, and so cold it felt like a judgment. In the center of this cold, in the vast, empty expanse of packed earth before the largest mansion in the territory, Elior McRae stood alone. He was a young man, but the high plains had already carved lines of patience and hardship around his eyes and mouth. His coat, a deep brown wool, was frayed at the cuffs and worn thin across the shoulders. The collar turned up against an air that promised a bitter day. He wore it like it was armor. He held no rifle. His hands hung loose at his sides, empty, but his chin was high, his gaze fixed on the imposing white-painted wood of the house that Bartholomew Pike had built to mock the desert. He was alone, but only for the first few yards. Behind him, stretching back into the dissipating mist in a great, silent crescent, was his answer. 300 horsemen. They were a phalanx of shadows given form by the reluctant light, riders from the allied high country tribes, men who had answered a call deeper than blood. They sat their rangy mustangs with an inhuman stillness. They made no sound, no cough, no whisper, no stamp of a hoof. The only movement was the slow, rhythmic fog of their horses' breath mingling with the mist. On the manes of the war ponies, small charms of bone, feather, and polished stone glittered faintly, catching the first weak rays of the sun like a field of fallen stars. The heavy oak door of the mansion cracked open. The sound was obscenely loud in the quiet, a sharp tear in the fabric of the morning. Bartholomew Pike stepped out onto the wide veranda. He was a bull of a man, wide in the shoulders and gone soft in the middle, wrapped in a silk dressing gown that spoke of arrogance and wealth. He held a porcelain cup of coffee, and for a moment, he simply stared, his brain refusing to process the scene before him. The steam from his cup rose in a frantic plume. Beside him, his two chief lieutenants, Rufus Lyle and Chet Danner, were not so composed. They had come out flanking him, their hands instinctively near their holsters, but they froze solid. Rufus, a man whose reputation was built on casual brutality, went pale, his upper lip beaded with sweat despite the freezing air. Chet Danner, younger and quicker, simply stopped breathing. His eyes were wide, fixed on the sheer, impossible number of riders. They looked less like men and more like statues of fear, their bodies gone rigid, their coats suddenly looking too thin. A dry wind, born miles away in the canyons, chose that moment to sweep across the yard. It moaned through the bare branches of the cottonwoods Pike had planted along his fence line, a thirsty, hollow sound. The wind carried with it the collective, subtle noise of the army at Elior's back. It was not a war cry. It was the sound of 300 men and horses shifting their weight as one, the creak of saddle leather, the soft jingle of a bridle bit, the whisper of wool against cured hide. It was the sound of old debts stirring, of a bill long overdue finally arriving at the door, mounted shoulder to shoulder with Elior. So close their stirrups almost touched was Chief Niken. His own horse, a painted Appaloosa with a lean, wolfish build, stood in stark contrast to Elior's steady quarter horse. Niken was a man made of cured leather and ancient wisdom. The map of 1,000 seasons was etched into his face, but his eyes, when they turned to Elior, were not weary. They were as bright and sharp as the obsidian tips of the arrows in the quiver on his back. He watched Pike and his men absorb the reality of the morning. Then, slowly, he gave a single, slight nod. It was a transfer of power, a gesture that gave Elior the floor. It said, "This is your truth. Speak it." The town of Dry Comet was watching, behind the curtains of the plankboard shops and small houses lining the main street. The entire populace was holding its breath. A face would appear in a window, pale and wide-eyed, before vanishing behind gingham or lace. They saw the riders. They saw Elior, the young rancher they had watched be humiliated. They saw Pike, the man who owned their debts, their water, and their sheriff. In the small, cold rooms, a few of the more pious townsfolk began to pray. Most, however, just listened to the hammering of their own hearts, counting the breaths they had left. Bartholomew Pike's gaze tore away from the terrifying sea of warriors and snapped to the center of his yard. His focus narrowed, and his face, which had been slack with shock, tightened with a new, specific dread. Someone, in the dead of night, had driven a stark wooden post into the ground. It was raw, splintered pine, planted not 10 yards from his veranda steps. It was an invasion. It was a marker. It was the designated point for a reckoning, an appointment with the truth, set in the very soil Pike claimed as his own. Pike swallowed, hard. The sound, a dry click in his throat, was audible to his men. The coffee cup in his hand began to tremble, rattling against its saucer. Elior McRae drew a single, deep breath. The air was sharp, tasting of frost and sagebrush and the faint, dusty smell of the horses behind him. As the cold air filled his lungs, it brought the memory back. Not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. He felt the sudden, shocking cold of the water, the slime of the trough, the searing pain of laughter that felt like lashes on his skin. He remembered the exact shade of the sky 1 week ago, when his honor had been dragged from him and buried in the mud and filthy well water of Red Butte Crossing. 1 week earlier, the sun was not a judgment then. It was a promise of coin, a hot, brassy glare that beat down on the chaos of the Red Butte Crossing market day. The air was thick with the smells of horse sweat, dry dust, curing tobacco, and the sharp tang of cheap whiskey already being spilled from the saloon. Men shouted, haggled, and lied. Hammers rang from the blacksmith's shop, a constant sharp percussion against the lowing of cattle and the frantic bleating of penned sheep. Elior McRae pushed his way through the throng. His shoulders set where he felt a rare, clean thread of pride. Ahead of him, guided by his steady hand and a low, calm voice, were his 7 calves. They were the best he had ever raised, fat, sleek, and round from a summer spent on high-pasture clover, their coats shining. They were proof that the small McRae ranch, the one his father had bled for and died on, was more than just a patch of dusty hope. These 7 animals represented a future. They meant new boots, seed for the spring, and perhaps enough left over to finally fix the leak in the cabin roof. He guided them into the auction pens, easing them into a holding area with a gentle touch on their flanks. He ignored the assessing. Sometimes jealous, glances from other ranchers, he closed the gate, gave the lead calf a final pat, and walked toward the auctioneer's block, his worn leather ledger tucked under his arm. He saw Bartholomew Pike before Pike saw him. It was impossible not to. Pike held the center of the market square like a large, ornate piece of furniture, immovable and gaudy. He was flanked by Rufus Lyle and Chet Danner, both men wearing their pistols high and their expressions bored, as if the entire market was a minor inconvenience. Pike was laughing, a booming, chest-heavy sound, at something the auctioneer had said. When Pike's eyes finally landed on Elior, the laughter did not stop, but it changed. The humor evaporated, leaving only a dry, abrasive sound. He watched Elior's calves being nudged into the main ring, and a slow, appraising look crossed his face. He leaned over and whispered something to Rufus. Rufus nodded, a predatory stillness coming over him, and he detached himself from Pike's side, melting into the crowd of buyers. Elior's stomach tightened. He knew that look. The auctioneer, a man named Bemis, who owed his position entirely to Pike's patronage, started the bidding for the McRae calves. "All right, folks, a fine bunch here. 7 prime yearlings from the McRae hold. What am I bid who'll start me at $10 a head?" Silence. A few buyers, men who had bid on Elior's stock before, suddenly found the dust on their boots to be the most fascinating thing in the territory. A man named Tully, who ran a small butchery, half raised his hand, then lowered it quickly as if he had been stung. Elior scanned the crowd. He saw Rufus Lyle standing just behind Tully, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder, whispering in his ear. Elior could not hear the words, but he knew them. Road fee, Pike's toll, long ride home. It was Pike's favorite method: economic strangulation backed by the implied promise of a broken axle or a spooked herd on a dark trail. $10, Bemis called out, his voice now sounding nervous. Come now, gentlemen. Look at the hide on him. $8, who'll give me 8? Another man, a buyer from Santa Fe, opened his mouth. Chet Danner, now on the other side of the pen, simply shook his head. Once. The buyer's mouth closed. Sold, Bemis finally shouted, slamming his gavel. For $6 a head to Mr. Pike's account. Elior felt the blood drain from his face. $6. It was less than theft. It was a statement. It would not even cover his costs. He stood frozen for a beat, the noise of the market turning into a dull roar in his ears. Pike had not just bought his cattle. He had announced to the entire territory that Elior McRae was not allowed to compete. He forced his legs to move. He walked to the small wooden table where Bemis was scribbling in a ledger, his hands shaking slightly. Elior had to collect his money. He had to finish the transaction, to swallow the insult, and get out. He took the $42 in paper script, his face a mask of iron control, and turned to leave. Pike and his men were waiting for him. They had positioned themselves directly in his path, near the main horse trough that served the entire street. Hard day, McRae. Pike's voice was a buttery purr of false sympathy. Elior did not look up. He clutched his ledger. Mr. Pike. He tried to step around them. In a hurry, Rufus Lyle said, stepping to block him. You ain't even gonna thank Mr. Pike for taking that stringy stock off your hands. Move, Rufus, Elior said, his voice low and flat. What's that? Chet Danner chimed in, grinning. He was standing on the other side of Elior, effectively boxing him in against the trough. He's got an important paper there, must be counting all his profits. Chet lunged, grabbing for the ledger. Elior spun away, pulling it back, but the movement put him off balance. At the exact same moment, Rufus Lyle stuck out his boot. It was a practiced, cruel piece of choreography. Elior's feet tangled. He had no hands to catch himself. One was holding the script, the other his ledger. He stumbled backward, his heel hitting the base of the trough, and he fell. The fall was total. He went over the wooden lip, backward, and crashed into the water. It was a shocking, paralyzing cold. The water was filthy, a thick, green-black soup of algae, horse slaver, tobacco spit, and God knows what else. It filled his mouth, his nose, his ears. For a full second, the market went dead silent. It was the silence of a held breath, of 50 people watching a man vanish into filth. Then, Pike laughed. It was the signal. The silence shattered. Laughter erupted, sharp and loud and brutal. It came from Pike's men first, but others joined in nervous, relieved laughter from men who were just glad it was not them. The sound was like a volley of whips, cutting into Elior as he surfaced. Gasping and spitting, he grabbed the edge of the trough, hauling himself up. Slime and weeds hung from his hair and shoulders. Water streamed from his clothes, pooling in the dust at his feet. He was shaking, less from the cold than from the sudden, violent humiliation. His hat had fallen by his boot. He reached for it. Pike's heavy, ornate boot slammed down on the brim, pinning it to the muddy ground. Now hold on, son, Pike said, his eyes glittering. A man in your position needs to look the part. Pike was not a fast man, but his movements now were deliberate. He reached to the sheath on his hip and drew a long, silver-inlaid skinning knife. The crowd quieted again, sensing the spectacle was not over. Pike bent down, his knees cracking, and picked up Elior's hat. It was an old hat, sun-bleached and sweat-stained, but it was sturdy. On the side, his mother had stitched the small McRae brand, a simple M over a crescent moon. Pike held it up. A bit ambitious. This branding ain't it for a man who's got nothing, with a swift, practiced motion. Pike sliced the knife through the felt. He cut the entire crown of the hat clean off, leaving only a floppy, useless brim. He held the crown up for the crowd to see, the small stitched brand facing them. "The Great McRae brand," he announced. Then, he gathered phlegm in his throat and spat, a thick, dark stream of tobacco juice that landed directly on the emblem. He threw the severed piece into the mud. "A rootless pup," Pike snarled, his voice dropping but carrying in the silence. He kicked the muddy piece of felt toward Elior. "You ain't got no roots here. You're just a stray dog trying to eat at my table, and I'm tired of it." Elior stood there, dripping, his hair plastered to his skull. He looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw men he had shared drinks with, men who had nodded to him on this very street that morning. They looked away. Their faces were a mixture of pity, shame, and fear. He saw Deputy Sheriff Harlan, the man paid to keep the peace. Harlan was standing on the steps of the land office, his arms crossed over his badge. He was watching the whole thing. He was part of the landscape, as still and useless as a fence post. He was Pike's man, paid for by settled debts at the saloon. The moment stretched. Elior's shame was so profound it almost choked him. He could feel the cold water seeping into his boots, the grit between his teeth. Then, through the crowd, he saw her, Juniper Vale. She was standing on the boardwalk in front of the new schoolhouse, a book held tight to her chest. She taught the children of Dry Comet during the day, and she sang at the Red Garter Saloon 2 nights a week, the one Pike owned to earn enough to keep the school stocked with chalk and paper. She saw everything in this town, from its innocent mornings to its drunken, corrupt nights. She was not looking away. Her face was white. Her knuckles, where she gripped the book, were even whiter. Her dark eyes were wide and shaking with a fury that mirrored his own. She took a small, instinctive step off the boardwalk, a motion to go to him, to offer a hand, anything. She froze. Chet Danner, still grinning, had turned his head. He was staring directly at her. He did not say a word. He just looked at her, then at the schoolhouse, then back at her. The threat was as clear as the knife in Pike's hand. She stopped, trapped on the boardwalk, her eyes screaming the help she could not give. Elior broke the gaze. He looked back at Pike. He did not lunge. He did not speak. His movements were slow, as if he were moving underwater. He bent down, his knees protesting in the cold, wet denim. He reached past Pike's boot and picked up the ruined, floppy brim of his hat. He then reached into the mud and retrieved the severed crown, the brand now obliterated by tobacco and filth. Finally. He picked up his sales ledger. The pages were soaked, the ink of his season's work bleeding into an illegible blue-black stain. He stood up to his full height. His eyes were red-rimmed, but they were calm. It was a terrifying, bottomless calm. He held the wet, ruined things to his chest. Pike saw the silence not as control, but as defeat. He laughed, satisfied, and turned to the crowd. "This town has no room for outsiders," he bellowed, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "This is Pike territory. You live here, you work here, you abide by my rules. You try to get above yourself. You end up in the mud. Remember that?" Elior turned his back on him. He turned his back on the silent crowd, on the complicit deputy, on the trapped gaze of Juniper Vale. He began to walk. He walked out of the market square, his boots squelching, leaving a trail of trough water and mud in the thick dust. The town watched him go. Not a single person spoke. He was a solitary, soaked, and desecrated figure, walking away from the heart of the town, clutching the symbols of his failure. The walk back to his ranch was 5 miles. The sun beat down, turning the wet mud on his clothes into a stiff, abrasive shell. The humiliation did not fade. It baked into him. But as he walked, something else began to happen. The shaking stopped. The water in his ears dried. The shame cooled. And as it cooled, it hardened. In his chest, a new feeling was born. It was not the hot, quick-burning rage he had expected. It was something else. It was something cold, something patient, something heavier and more permanent. It was a decision. Pike had called him rootless. Pike had used a rope to trip him. Pike had drowned him in public filth. As Elior crested the last ridge and saw the small, vulnerable shape of his cabin in the distance, the decision settled into his bones. They thought he was an outsider, a pup, a stray with no connections. They had forgotten about the old marks, the ones hidden by his sleeve. They had forgotten about the people of the high country, the ones who had watched him grow from a distance. Pike had made a terrible mistake. He had shown his entire hand in a fit of public arrogance. He had used his power to humiliate one man. Elior knew, as he pulled open his cabin door, that he would not be coming back to town with a gun. That was Pike's way, a fool's game. He would come back with the truth, and he would not be coming back alone. The cabin was cold when he returned, the silence inside a heavy, damp blanket. The smell of the trough water clung to him, a putrid perfume of algae and animal spit that felt like it had seeped into his very skin. He stood for a long moment in the middle of the floor, the ruined pieces of his hat and the pulpy, unreadable ledger still clutched in his hand. He dropped them onto the rough-hewn table. The sound was a wet, heavy slap. The decision he had made on the long walk home had not been born of fire. It had been born of the icy, filthy water, a cold clarity that had settled deep in his gut. Pike had used public shame as his weapon. He had isolated him, branded him an outsider, cut him off from the community with laughter and fear. Pike believed he had no one to turn to, no foundation, no roots. Elior's hand, raw and scraped from his fall, instinctively went to his left wrist. He rubbed his thumb over the thin, faded lines hidden beneath his cuff. The sensation was a key, unlocking a memory so potent it pushed the cold filth of the present day aside. The world dissolved from the smell of trough water to the smell of ozone and wet pine. He was 12 years old, and the sky over the maple arroyos was a bruised, sickly purple. He was riding his father's mare, checking a fence line that was always the first to go in a storm. The air was dead, holding its breath, and then the sound came. It was not rain, it was a roar, a low, grinding sound like a freight train coming through the canyon floor. A flash flood. Before he could even turn the mare, the water was on them. It was not water, but a rolling wall of mud, boulders, and shattered trees. The mare screamed, rearing as the first wave hit her legs. Elior was thrown, rolling through the debris, scrambling for purchase on the slick, collapsing embankment. He clawed his way up, his fingers digging into the mud, and hauled himself onto a high ledge of sandstone, just as the full force of the torrent tore past, ripping the fence posts from the ground as if they were matchsticks. His horse was gone, swept away. He was alone, shaking, his lungs burning, and then he heard a sound, thin and high, nearly lost in the roar, across the raging 20-foot-wide river of mud. A small girl was trapped. She was clinging to the high branches of a cottonwood tree that was already groaning under the water's assault. She was not screaming, but making a high, terrified sound, her knuckles white where she gripped the branch. She was small, perhaps 8 or 9, and her dark, soaked hair was plastered to her face. Elior did not think. He ran along the embankment, his mind racing. His father's lariat was on the lost saddle. He had nothing. He looked at his own bridle, the one his father had let him build. He ripped one of the long, thick leather reins free from the bit. It was not much. It was torn and old. He tied a heavy stone to one end. He shouted, his voice cracking. "Here, catch this." He threw it once. The current snatched it, the stone vanishing. He pulled it back, his hands already stinging. He threw it again, higher this time. The girl, her eyes wide with terror, let go with one hand and lunged. Her small fingers caught the leather. "Wrap it," Elior screamed over the din. "Wrap it around your arm." She did, her movements clumsy with cold and fear. Elior braced himself, planting his broken boots in the slick mud, and pulled. The tension on the rein was terrifying. The current fought him, trying to tear the leather from his grasp, trying to pull the girl from her tree. "You have to let go," he shouted. "You have to trust it." He saw her take a breath, close her eyes, and drop from the branch into the raging water. The force of it nearly tore his arms from their sockets. The rain bit into his palms, slicing the skin. He did not feel it. He leaned back, his heels digging, his entire 12-year-old body straining against the weight of the girl and the full, murderous power of the flood. He pulled, hand over raw hand. His teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. The leather was slick, not just with mud, but with his own blood. She was a dead weight, a piece of debris. And then suddenly she was in the shallows, gasping, crawling, trying to find purchase. Elior lunged down, grabbed the front of her tunic, and hauled her the last few feet onto the muddy bank. They lay there for a long time, side by side, spitting mud and coughing, their chests heaving. The sky was still a violent purple, but the worst of the flood's roar was already beginning to subside, the water level dropping as fast as it had risen. The silence that fell afterward was almost as shocking as the noise. It was broken only by their gasping breaths. Then, from the trees on the high ridge, the riders came. They did not ride like the men from the town. They made no sound. They emerged from the wet piñón and cedar like shadows, their horses unshod, their faces painted in lines of black and gray. Within seconds, a dozen men surrounded the two children. Elior scrambled to his feet, trying to put himself between the girl and the riders, but he was shaking too hard to stand straight. A man dismounted. He was taller than Elior's father, a man whose presence seemed to command the very air. His face was a map of hard authority. He walked past Elior as if he were not there and went straight to the girl. He knelt, his movements fluid and economical, and touched her face. She spoke, her voice small but clear, in a language Elior did not understand. She pointed to the receding, muddy water, and then she pointed at Elior. The tall man, Chief Nikon, turned his gaze on the boy. He looked at Elior's muddy, torn clothes. He looked at the torn rein still clutched in Elior's hand. He looked at Elior's hands, which were now bleeding freely, the skin flayed open in a dozen places. Nikon said nothing. He walked to Elior. The boy flinched but held his ground, his chin up. He had done no wrong. Nikon reached out and, his touch surprisingly gentle, took Elior's left wrist. He studied the bloody palm, then turned the arm over. With his other hand, he drew a knife from a sheath on his belt. It was not steel. It was a sliver of black obsidian, sharp as a razor. Nikon spoke, his voice low and guttural. The girl, Ayana, his daughter, translated in a small, shaky voice. He says you have spilled your blood for his blood. You have pulled her from the water. Nikon pressed the tip of the obsidian blade to Elior's skin, just below the wrist. Elior hissed as the blade cut, quick and clean. It was not a deep cut, but it was precise. Nikon made a series of small, flowing cuts, and the blood welled up, dark and red. The chief then took a small pouch from his belt, dipped his thumb into a dark, blue-black ash, and rubbed it forcefully into the open wounds. The pain was sharp, a burning sting, but Elior did not pull away. He watched as the man carved a symbol into his skin. It was not a feather. It was the long, sleek, flowing shape of a river otter. Brother of water, Ayana translated, her voice stronger now. He marks you. The water took your blood, and it took his. Now, you are kin. Nikon released his arm, nodded once, and then, with his daughter, mounted up, the riders turned and melted back into the trees as silently as they had come. Elior was left alone on the muddy bank, his hands on fire, with a new, permanent promise bleeding under his skin. He had never seen Ayana again. He had seen Nikon only at a distance, alone, watching figure on a high ridge. Gone an instant later, but the connection remained. It was a silent, one-sided conversation over the years. When Elior was 15 and broke his arm falling from the barn roof, a small, buckskin pouch of powerful, sweet-smelling salve had appeared on his porch. It had reduced the swelling and taken the pain in a way no town doctor ever could. He learned to live between the two worlds, the town of Dry Comet, with its rules, its gossip, and its sudden, casual cruelties, saw him as a half-wild outsider. The ranchers on the adjoining lands respected his boundaries, mostly because they knew he never pushed his cattle past the Coyote Spur Ridge, the unmarked line that separated the territory from the high country lands. Nikan watched when a 2-year drought threatened to dry up the McRae land entirely. Elior had woken one morning to the sound of gurgling water. His irrigation ditch, which had been a ribbon of cracked mud, was flowing deep and cold. He had followed it up into the foothills, a mile above his property line. The stream that fed his ditch had been cleverly, precisely rerouted. A series of small, moss-covered stones, invisible to any but a searching eye, had been moved to open a new channel from a higher, stronger spring. The work was masterful. There were no boot prints, only a few moccasin tracks that vanished on the hard rock. Elior had never called in the favor. He never went to the high country seeking help. The mark on his wrist was not a coin to be spent. It was a bond to be honored. He honored it with silence, with respect for their borders, and by keeping his own hands clean. Now, back in his cabin, the stink of the trough filling his lungs, Elior stripped off his fouled, stiffening clothes. He dropped them in a heap by the door. He walked to the wash basin, his body numb. With a rough bar of lye soap, he began to scrub his skin, scrubbing until it was raw, washing away the green slime and the smell of Pike's contempt. He was not just washing away the filth. He was preparing himself. Clean. He stood in the center of the room, water dripping onto the floorboards. He looked at his left wrist. The mark was still there, faded to a network of pale, silvery lines, but it was as much a part of him as his bones. He crossed the room to the heavy pine chest his father had built. He opened the lid. The smell of old wool and cedar rose to meet him. He bypassed his father's rifle, his mother's letters. His hand went to a small, oilcloth packet tucked in the corner. He had found it on a fence post 5 years ago, a gift left for no reason other than to be left. He opened it. Inside were 3 small, tightly bound bundles of dried herbs, sage, cedar, and sweetgrass, a signal kit. Bartholomew Pike had called him rootless. He had called him a pup, an outsider with no one to back his play. Pike knew only the rules of the town, the rules of bought sheriffs and coerced merchants. He knew nothing of the promises kept in silence, of the debts honored not with coin, but with water and salve and stone. Elior touched the faded, otter-shaped scar. For 13 years, he had kept his side of the bond in silence. Tonight, he would light the fire. He would send the signal. He would climb Fox Den Bluff and make the smoke rise in the sacred, threefold way. He would, for the first time in his life, call his brother of the water. He did not light the signal fire that night. The decision, as cold and hard as it was, needed one more piece. A cold plan, like a cold fire, burns the hottest, and he would not strike the flint until he knew the full measure of the rot. Pike had used the public square as his theater, but the real power, Elior knew, was not in the boot or the knife. It was in the ink and paper, in the quiet, closed-door agreements that choked a town to death long before the violence ever started. He needed to see Juniper. His chance came 2 nights later. He sent a signal he knew only she would understand, a single, clean white rock placed on the sill of the schoolhouse window. A sign they had used before when she needed him to move a fallen tree or fix a broken shutter. It meant danger. It meant meet. The meeting place was Water Pump Station number 2, 2 miles west of the town limits, where the aquifer ran shallow and the territory's maintenance was sloppy. It was a place of isolation and noise. The rhythmic, metallic clank hiss of the steam-fed pump, a reliable cover for any quiet conversation. He waited in the deep shadow of the corrugated iron pump house, the moon just a sliver, providing no light to betray him. The air was cold, but he was dressed for it, his clean but worn coat buttoned to his throat. He was not the dripping, humiliated victim from the market. He was someone else now, a man pared down to pure, cold purpose. She came on foot, having left her horse a quarter-mile back in an arroyo. She moved through the sagebrush like a shadow, making no sound. He did not see her until she was 10 feet away. a dark form detaching itself from the other shadows. "Elior," she whispered, her voice snatched away by the hiss of the pump. "I'm here." He stepped out. She did not rush to him. There was no comfort offered, no time for pity. She was all business, her face pale and taut in the faint starlight, her eyes wide and burning with a cold anger that matched his own. "I was hoping you would call," she said, her voice low and fast. "I've been in the saloon office. I've been singing for them, Elior, and every time Pike asks for that song about the Brazos, I make sure the bookkeeper goes for another drink. I've been copying." She pulled a sheaf of folded papers from inside her cloak. "I couldn't take the main ledger. It's in the safe. But these are the daily cash books, the receipts. It's all here." They huddled against the vibrating wall of the pump house, the metal warm from the boiler inside. She struck a match and lit a small, shielded lantern, keeping the light low and pointed at the papers in her lap. The rhythmic clank hiss of the pump was their shield, a steady, mechanical heartbeat in the dark. "It's not just greed, Elior," she said, her finger tracing a line of neat copperplate script. "It's a structure. He's building a cage." Her finger stopped. "Look, Judge Harlan, a monthly payment, $50, every month, for 2 years. The notation says legal retainer." "A bribe," Elior said. It was not a question. "It's the lock," she whispered. "It's why Deputy Harlan stood and watched you. Pike doesn't own the deputy. He owns the judge. The law in Dry Comet is whatever Bartholomew Pike decides it is on any given morning." She turned a page. "And the freight lines. You know the road fees Rufus was collecting from the buyers at your auction?" He nodded, the memory of his empty-handed bidders still fresh. "It's official. Pike bought the charter for the Double Star Freight Company 6 months ago. He's the silent partner. Any merchant who wants to ship goods in or out, east of the San Cristobal Ridge, has to use his line. And he's charging them. Elior, he's charging them 30% over the Texas rate. He's taxing every bag of flour, every keg of nails, every bolt of cloth that enters this territory." Elior felt the coldness in his chest settle even deeper. "He's not just a rancher. He's a toll collector. He's a strangler," Juniper said, her voice shaking with a sudden, violent intensity. She unfolded a separate, larger document. "And this is the rope." He looked. It was a formal contract, heavy paper with an embossed seal. It was an exclusive agreement between the newly formed Dry Comet Granary and the territory's main railhead shipping agent. It gave the granary the sole and exclusive right to buy and sell all grain wheat, barley, and corn in the entire county. "He's choking the food supply," Elior breathed, his mind grasping the full, horrifying scope of it. "He forces the ranchers to sell to him at his price, and he forces the townsfolk to buy from him at his price." "And look who the partners in this new granary are," she said, her finger moving to the bottom of the page. The signatures were there, arrogant and sloppy. "Rufus Lyle, Chet Danner, his boot heelers," Elior said, disgust thick in his throat. "They're his fist," she corrected. "They hold the contract. They're the ones who go to the farms, who stand in the fields, and negotiate the price." "Who can say no, Elior? Who can afford to have their harvest rot in the field because they won't sell to Pike's men?" She finally looked up from the papers, her eyes finding his in the dark. The fury in them was now mixed with a profound, terrible sadness. "He's calling in the debts," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the clank of the pump. "At the general store, his store, Sarah Polly's daughter, Beth, the one with the bright red hair who sits in the front row, her mother owed $12. $12, Elior, for flour and seed." Elior knew Sarah, a widow, trying to work a small, dry farm 2 miles south of town. "Pike's men evicted them this afternoon," Juniper said. And now, a single, hot tear cut a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She angrily wiped it away. "I was at the schoolhouse. I watched them. They put her stove, her bed, and Beth's little wooden doll in the middle of the street. Because she couldn't pay for the flour she was forced to buy from him. At his price. With the seed he sold her that he knew wouldn't grow on her land." Elior went perfectly still, the image of the child's doll in the street, of the widow watching her life thrown into the dust, fused with the memory of his own humiliation. The trough, the spat-on brand, the laughing crowd, it was all one and the same. It was not an attack on one man. It was the conquest of a people, one small, cruel act at a time. "He's rooting them out," Elior said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "He's taking the land, not with a gun, but with a ledger. He means to own all of it," she said. "The land, the water, the food, and the people." Elior looked down at the papers, at the evidence of a meticulous, suffocating evil. "A gun won't fix this," he said, half to himself. Juniper looked at him, surprised. "What?" "A gun," he repeated, looking at her. "That's what he expects. He expects me to come back, blind with rage, try to shoot him in the street, and Deputy Harlan will shoot me in the back. Or Rufus will, and the town will call it justifiable, and the judge Pike owns will sign the paper, and the whole thing will be buried with me. That's his game. That's the game he's played a dozen times." He shook his head, folding the papers slowly and handing them back to her. "I'm not going to play his game. This is the weapon." He tapped the papers in her hand. "This proof. But it's not enough. Proof is useless if the jury is too terrified to look at it." He turned and looked north, past the dark plains, to the jagged black silhouette of the San Cristobal Ridge. "He called me rootless," Elior said. "He's wrong. He just doesn't know what my roots are. We need to pull his roots up. Juniper, all of them, in the daylight, in the open, where the whole town has to watch." Juniper's eyes followed his gaze to the mountains. A sudden understanding dawned on her face. "The high country," she breathed. "You're going to them, to the tribes." She took a step closer, her hand moving to his arm. "Elior, you can't take the pass at Cinder Creek. Pike keeps a man there, always. A watchman with a long glass. He'll see you miles before you get there." She reached back inside her cloak, pulling out a second, smaller, rolled-up piece of oilcloth. I thought you might go north. This is the only other way." She unrolled it. It was a map, hand-drawn on old hide, the lines marked in charcoal. "It's the old Coyote Spur. My grandfather used it, back before the territory was settled. It's steep, and it's dangerous, but it's fast. It bypasses the narrows, and it will put you on the high ridge, above his watchman, before the sun is even up." He took the map from her. His hand was steady. As she passed it to him, her fingers, cold from the night air, brushed against his left wrist. His cuff was still pulled back slightly from his preparations. Her fingers froze, her breath caught in her throat. In the faint, flickering light of the lantern, she saw the pale, silvery lines etched into his skin, the long, sleek shape of the otter. "Dear God," she whispered, her eyes lifting from the scar to his face. She was not just looking at him. She was seeing him, seeing the past that he had never spoken of. The stories, the old women in town. They talk about the flood at Maple Arroyos, about Chief Nicken's daughter. That was... She stared at him, her hand still hovering over his wrist, not daring to touch the mark again, as if it were a holy and terrifying thing. "Elior, is that what this is? Is that..." A call. He looked into her eyes. The coldness, the hard purpose, was still there. But beneath it, she saw the 12-year-old boy, the blood on his hands, the promise made in fire and ash. He gave a single, slow, solemn nod. "It's a call." The clank hiss of the pump seemed to fade, the entire world narrowing to the space between them. "Then you have to go," she said, her voice firm again, the awe replaced by the same iron resolve that was in him. "You have to go now." She stepped back, taking the lantern and the ledger pages. "The plan is simple. Then, evidence, witnesses, and pressure." "I will go and get the pressure," Elior said. "I will bring a witness that Bartholomew Pike cannot bribe and cannot shoot. And I will get the evidence," she said, her chin high. "Juniper, no, you've done enough. It's too dangerous." "You think I'm not in danger now?" she countered, a sharp, bitter edge to her voice. "He owns the building I teach in. He owns the saloon I sing in. He's suffocating my children. I'm not going to just... Wait, I know when he's out. I know where he keeps the key to the safe. I will get the real ledger. Elior. The one with his signature, not just his dog's." Their plan was set, forged in the dark by the thumping, mechanical heart of the pump. Elior took the map. "He will see us fall. Juniper, both of us, but we're gonna fall on him like a mountain." He turned, not looking back, and moved to the shadows where his horse was tied. He checked the cinch, his movements economical and practiced. He strapped the small oilcloth packet with the signal herbs to his saddle horn. He mounted the horse in one fluid motion. He looked down, just once. She was standing there, a small, brave, furious light in the vast, uncaring dark, holding the papers that proved their world was built on a lie. He turned his horse north, toward the black, jagged line of the San Cristobal Ridge, and urged the animal into a silent lope, vanishing into the enormous, waiting dark. He had not ridden straight for the ridge. After leaving Juniper at the pump station, he had circled back to his cabin, moving through the deep arroyos, avoiding the open land. He had to prepare. The Coyote Spur Trail was high and unforgiving. It required food, warm clothes, and the signal herbs. The decision to go was cold and hard. But the leaving of it, the leaving was a different matter. He was inside his cabin, the door barred, a single lamp burning low. He was packing jerky and hardtack into his saddlebags when the rain started. It was not a violent storm, but a cold, steady, miserable drizzle, the kind that promised to last until dawn. It hissed on the tin roof, a sound like 1,000 whispering voices, reminding him of his isolation. He was checking the cinch on his saddle for the third time when he heard the sound. It was not a knock. It was a soft, scraping sound at his door, like a branch or a small animal. He froze. His hand went to the pistol on his hip. He moved to the door, his boots silent on the plank floor. "Elior." The whisper was so faint. It was almost part of the rain. His heart seemed to stop, then restart with a painful jolt. He fumbled with the wooden bar, his hands suddenly clumsy, and pulled the heavy door open. She was standing there, soaked, Juniper. Her dark cloak was streaming water, her hair plastered to her face, her shoulders shaking with cold. In her hands, she held a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Juniper, my God," he breathed, pulling her inside. "You can't be here. If Pike's men—" "They're in town," she said, her teeth chattering. "They're all at the saloon, drinking him rich. I know their routines. I had to come." She pushed the bundle into his hands. "It's cornbread and something else. You can't go on an empty stomach." He looked at the small, damp package, then at her face. The anger that had been his only fuel for 2 days was suddenly complicated by a rush of something else, something so powerful and terrifying it almost buckled his knees. He set the bundle on the table and, without a word, took her by the arm and pulled her back outside, under the shallow overhang of the eaves. "Inside is too bright," he murmured, pulling the door almost shut behind them, leaving them in the cold, wet darkness. The rain fell in a solid, shimmering curtain just inches from their faces. The air smelled of wet pine, ozone, and the damp wool of her cloak. "You're shaking," he said. "It's cold," she replied, though they both knew it was more than that. He was wearing his heavy ranch coat, the one he had just finished cleaning. He had not buttoned it. He looked down at her, a small, fierce, trembling woman who had just risked her life to bring him bread. She looked up, her face pale in the gloom. She saw the tension in his jaw, the deep, hollowed-out look in his eyes. She saw the man who had been humiliated and the man who was preparing to call down a storm. She took a small step, moving into his space, inside the open flaps of his coat. Her hands, small and freezing, came up. She did not touch his chest. She grabbed the thick wool lapels of his coat and pulled them forward, wrapping them around her own shoulders, cocooning herself inside the shelter of his body. It was a desperate, proprietary act. a claiming of warmth and safety. She was standing flush against him now, her head fitting perfectly under his chin. He went rigid. He could feel the fine, cold trembling of her entire body. He could smell her hair, the faint, clean scent of lye soap and rainwater. Slowly, as if afraid the moment would shatter, he lowered his head. His forehead came to rest against hers. They stood like that for a full minute, breathing each other's air, the rain forming a rattling, drumming wall around them. His hand, which had been hanging useless at his side, lifted. He had roped steers, built fences, and fought men. His hands were calloused and sure. But now, as he lifted it to her face, it was trembling. His fingers, rough and thick, fumbled at the side of her head. He was searching for the simple, carved bone pin that she always used to tie her hair back. His thumb brushed the soft skin behind her ear, and he felt her breath hitch, a small, sharp gasp against his chest. He found the pin. He worked it loose, his movements clumsy with an emotion he had no name for. The pin came free, and her heavy, damp hair spilled down over his hand, thick and cool. "I will come back," he whispered. His voice was a low rasp, meant only for her and the rain. "Before the sun is up, 1 week from today." He dropped the pin into his coat pocket, and his hand returned, cupping her jaw. His thumb moved to the corner of her mouth. She turned her face slightly, kissing his thumb. That was all it took. He lowered his head, and his mouth found hers. The first kiss was not a question. It was a statement. It was deep and certain, but it was gentle. It was the taste of rainwater and cornbread and the cold night air. It was slow, a deliberate exploration, a sealing of the pact they had made at the pump station. But the gentleness lasted only a moment. Beneath it was the fire, the desperation, the shared fury, and the long, unspoken ache of two lonely people living on the edge of a brutal world. The kiss deepened, became urgent. Her breath caught in her throat, a choked, broken sound, and it was that sound that undid him. His other arm came around her, pulling her so tight against him he could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of her heart against his ribs. His hand left her jaw and slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the hair he had just unbound. Her hands, which had been clutching his coat, found their way inside. They splayed across his chest, her cold palms a shock against the warm flannel of his shirt. Then, as the kiss became a raw, breathless exchange, her hands moved. They slid up his chest, over his shoulders, and locked together at the back of his neck. They were not just holding each other, they were clinging. At the same moment, their free hands found each other in the space between them, his calloused fingers interlaced with her slender ones. Their palms met, and their fingers locked. A sudden, desperate, crushing grip. It was not a caress. It was an oath. It was agreement. It was respect. It was the silent, screaming promise that neither of them was in this alone. The world dissolved. There was no Pike, no town, no humiliation. There was only the roar of the rain on the tin roof, the smell of her skin, and the feeling of her breathlessness as it met his. When they finally broke apart, it was not a full separation. They were both gasping, their breathing ragged and sharp. She turned her head, pressing her face into the hollow of his shoulder, her ear against his chest. He could feel her listening to the hammering of his heart. He bent his head, resting his forehead on the crown of her hair, and just breathed. He was shaking as hard as she was. He had faced down Pike's men, floods, and blizzards with a steadier hand. This vulnerability was the most terrifying thing he had ever known. A promise, he thought, felt like a thread, tied from his wrist to hers. The cold finally seeped through. A gust of wind drove the rain into their shelter, spattering their faces. "You're frozen," he murmured, his voice thick. "Come inside." He guided her back into the cabin, shutting the door and barring it. The single lamp cast long, flickering shadows. The stove in the corner was dark, the embers having died to a faint, red glow. I was just making coffee," he lied, needing to do something with his hands. He went to the stove. He knelt, opening the iron door, and grabbed a few pieces of kindling. His hands were still unsteady. He dropped a piece of piñón, and it clattered on the hearth. A small sound came from behind him. He looked over his shoulder. She was watching him, a faint, trembling smile on her lips. She laughed, a soft, breathy sound. It was the first time he had heard her laugh in days. She came and knelt beside him on the small, worn rug. The warmth from the dying embers touched her face. She did not say anything. She just reached out and put her hand over his, steadying him as he arranged the wood. "Here," she said. He struck a match. The flame wavered. Together, their hands shielding it, they held it to the kindling. The small twigs caught, flared, and a warm, golden light bloomed in the stove, pushing back the shadows, painting their faces in orange and red. They stayed there, kneeling by the fire, simply watching it catch. The look that passed between them in that new, warm light was a vow stronger than any they could have spoken. "We will have this," he said, his voice quiet. She looked at him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face in the firelight. "What?" "This," he said, gesturing to the fire, the cabin, the sound of the rain outside. "A home." She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat on the floor, the warmth of the growing fire seeping into their clothes. She finally spoke, her voice a whisper, as if saying it too loud would break the spell. "Sometimes I dream," she said, "about a house where it's quiet, where the only sound is the wind in the chimney, or the sound of bread rising in the pan." He looked at the rough log walls of his cabin. He saw it not as it was, but as it could be. He took her hand, the one that was not clutching his. "When this is done," he said, and his voice was rough with the promise of it, "I'll build onto this cabin. I'll add a room, a kitchen, with a big window, juniper, facing west. I'll build it so the sunset comes right through the glass every single evening, and you can stand there and listen to the bread rise." She squeezed his hand, her eyes closing. A single tear escaped, but it was not like the one at the pump station. This one was not from anger. They sat there for a long time, sharing the cornbread she had brought. They did not talk of Pike, or the ledgers, or the danger. They talked about the color to paint a door, and whether a porch should be covered, and the best way to plant a garden safe from the deer. They talked about all the small, normal, impossible things that they were fighting for. They did not rush. They held on to the moment, a small bubble of warmth and affection in a world of cold and violence. But the clock on the mantel ticked on. It neared midnight. "You have to go," he said, and the words were like stones in his throat. "It's not safe. You have to be in your own bed, in your own room, before anyone even knows you are gone." They stood. The long, hopeful hug was different from the desperate one on the porch. This one was slow, a deliberate act of memory. His arms went around her waist, and he buried his face in her rain-damp hair, breathing her in. Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she held him with a strength that belied her small frame. It was a hug of agreement, of deep, soulful affection, and of a terrifying, fragile hope. He let her go, his hands lingering on her arms. He walked her to the door, his heart feeling like it was being torn in two. He opened it. The rain was still falling, a relentless, cold shroud. "Elior, wait!" He turned. She was reaching into the pocket of her cloak. She pulled out the something else from the bundle. It was a simple, thin braid of dark brown leather, tidily and expertly woven. "It's not much," she said, her voice unsteady. "It's from a set of old reins, but it's strong." She took his left hand. His arm. She pushed back his sleeve. In the lamplight from the cabin, the pale, silvery scar on his wrist seemed to glow. The otter. She did not ask about it this time. She did not need to. She accepted it as part of him, as the part that had saved her, as the part that would save them. With careful, deliberate motions, she wrapped the leather braid around his wrist, covering the scar completely. She wrapped it twice, 3 times, the dark leather stark against his skin. She pulled the knot tight, her small, strong fingers working with purpose. The scar was the first vow, the promise of blood and water. The braid was the second, the promise of fire and home. The two vows were now one, bound together on his pulse. She did not kiss his lips. She raised his hand, his wrist, to her mouth, and pressed a kiss to the knot she had just tied. "Come back," she whispered against his skin. He could not speak. He only nodded. She let go of his hand, pulled her cloak tight, and slipped out the door, vanishing into the rain so quickly, it was as if she had never been there at all. Elior stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold rain blowing onto his face. He looked down at the dark leather braid on his wrist. Then, his face set, he turned, barred the door, and went to get his signal herbs. The rain that had blessed his meeting with Juniper turned on him as he climbed. The Coyote Spur Trail, just as she had warned, was not a trail for a man in a hurry. It was a treacherous, high-angled goat path, a slick ribbon of mud and shattered shale that wound upward into the black, unforgiving clouds. The world was reduced to the sound of his own horse slipping and scrambling, the groan of the saddle, and the relentless, driving hiss of the sleet as it turned from rain to ice. He rode with his head down, one hand on the reins, the other tucked inside his coat, his fingers wrapped around the warm, dry packet of herbs. His wrist, where Juniper's leather braid was knotted tight over Niken's old scar, throbbed with a dull, steady ache. He was a man carrying two vows, and the mountain was demanding payment in misery for every foot he gained. It was hours before dawn when he finally reached the crest, Fox Den Bluff. It was a high, exposed lip of granite, a place where the wind howled and the world fell away on three sides. The rain had stopped, as if by command, leaving the air brittle and painfully cold. Below, the entire territory was a sea of blackness, a pit of absolute dark. There was no town, no lights, no sign of Pike's world. He was alone, on the roof of the world. His hands were numb, his fingers like wooden pegs, but he worked with a ritualistic purpose. He built a small, tight pyre of the dry wood he had carried in his saddlebag. He did not use a match. He used his flint and steel, the sparks a tiny, defiant constellation in the dark. When the small fire caught, he unwrapped the oilcloth packet. He laid the sage, the cedar, and the sweetgrass on the fledgling flames. A thick, pungent, white smoke began to rise, not in a plume, but in a heavy, clinging cloud. He took the oilcloth and held it over the fire, trapping the smoke, gathering it. He counted to 10, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Then, he swept the cloth away. A single, solid puff of white smoke rose into the air, held its shape, and dissolved. He covered the fire again. He counted. He released. A second puff, clean and distinct, followed the first. He covered the fire a third time, his heart hammering against his ribs. A slow, heavy drumbeat. He held it, the old prayer of his childhood coming to his lips without his asking. He released. The third puff, the signal of the otter, the call of waterkin, rose into the black sky and was gone. He stood back, his work done. He waited. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise of the storm. It was an absolute, crushing stillness. The wind died, the fire crackled, its small light pathetic in the vastness. He stood there, a lone man on a high rock, feeling suddenly and terribly foolish. He was a rancher, soaked and freezing, sending smoke signals to a people he had not spoken to in 13 years. He was a fool, chasing a memory. A single pebble skittered on the granite behind him. Elior spun, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. He was not there. And then he was... A man stood not 10 feet away, motionless, as if he had risen from the rock itself. He was lean, wrapped in a wolf-hide cloak, and his face, in the faint firelight, was as sharp and unreadable as an axe head. It was Oro, Niken's chief scout. Oro did not speak. His eyes flickered from Elior's face, to the dying fire, and then down to Elior's left wrist. He saw the dark leather braid. He said nothing. He simply unslung a small, beaded water skin from his shoulder and held it out. Elior looked at the offering. This was the first test. He took the skin, unstopped it, and drank. The water was colder than the sleet, so cold it burned his throat, and it tasted of high mountain snow and iron and a clean, deep earthiness. It tasted like truth. He drank, then handed it back. Oro took the skin, nodded once, and turned his back. "Come," he said, the first word spoken. He moved off the bluff, not walking, but flowing over the rock, and vanished into the darkness. Elior scrambled to his horse, mounted, and followed the shadow. They rode for what remained of the night, moving deeper and higher into the high country. The very air changed. The world of dusty sage and grasping mesquite fell away, replaced by towering stands of pine, by deep, silent forests of white-barked aspen that looked like the ghosts of trees in the pre-dawn light. They arrived at Niken's main camp as the sun, which was a judgment on Pike's house, was just beginning to warm these high valleys with a pale, golden light. It was not a war camp. It was a village, tucked into a deep, sheltered bowl of land, shielded from the wind by the aspens. The air smelled of clean wood smoke and roasting meat. But as Oro and Elior rode into the central clearing, a silence fell. Work stopped. Children who had been playing in the dust went still. Women tanning hides let their scrapers rest. They emerged from lodges, their faces curious. And then, one by one, their curiosity hardened into a piercing, unblinking assessment. They were not looking at his face. They were all looking at his left wrist. They saw the braid, the dark, foreign knot from the valley. And they knew, by its placement, what it was covering. He was the man with the mark, the new Tata, the brother of water, and he had, after all these years, finally come. He was taken to the largest lodge, the one at the center of the camp. The air inside was warm and thick with the smell of sweet grass. Chief Nikan sat on a raised platform of firs, flanked by the elders of the allied tribes. They were men whose faces looked like they had been carved from the mountain itself. Loontrack, his hair white as the snow, his eyes a piercing black. Cedar Step, younger, broader, his power held in a solid, silent stillness. Flint Hollow, a man as old as Nikan, his face a map of scars. Elior was given no greeting. He was given no seat. He stood in the center of the lodge, on the bare earth, and waited. Nikan looked at him. The chief's eyes were unchanged from that day at the flood, bright and sharp, missing nothing. He looked at Elior's soaked clothes, his exhausted face, and the dark braid on his wrist. Finally, Nikan gestured to the floor. "You have come," he said. "Speak." Elior's voice was hoarse from the cold, but it did not waver. He spoke, his words clipped and clean. He did not plead. He did not posture. He reported. He told them about the 7 calves and the auctioneer's empty eyes. He told them about the trip rope and the fall. He described the taste of the trough water, the sound of the laughter, the feeling of the mud. He told them about the knife and the cut hat and the tobacco spit on his family's brand. When he finished that part, the elders were still, their faces impassive. "That," Elior said, his voice dropping, "was the noise. Now, here's the silence. Here's the real weapon." He unbuttoned his coat and reached into the oilcloth pouch he had kept dry against his chest. He pulled out the folded pages Juniper had copied from the saloon. He knelt, respectfully, and laid them on the hide mat at Niken's feet. "He calls it a ledger." Elior said, "It is a cage. This is how he strangles the town, so that he is the only one who can breathe." He pointed to the pages, his finger, raw and dirty from the climb, touching the neat script. "Here, the judge, bought for $50 a month. Here, the freight lines, his men, Rufus and Chet, own the only road for goods. They are taxing the food of the town. Here, the granary. They force ranchers to sell to them for nothing and sell it back to the widows for everything." He paused, and his voice became very quiet. "There is a woman in town, Sarah Polly. Her daughter is in Juniper's school. She owed $12. Yesterday, Pike's men threw her bed and her child's doll into the street. He is not just greedy. He is rooting them out, one by one, until he owns the valley, until he owns the water. He looked up, his gaze meeting Nikan's. "He called me rootless. He said I have no kin, no one to stand with me. I have come to see if he is right." Silence. A profound, heavy silence filled the lodge. Nikan did not move. He stared at the papers, at the proof of this civilized, bloodless sickness that was crawling up from the valley. He stared for a long time, so long that Elior's heart began to sink. At last, Nikan lifted his gaze, not to Elior but to the elders. Loontrack was the first to move. The old man reached into a pouch at his belt. He did not speak. He produced a single, long, gray and white feather from a loon. He leaned forward and placed it gently on top of Juniper's stolen papers. Cedar Step followed, his movements deliberate. He placed a bright blue jay feather next to the first. Flint Hollow, the scarred elder, added his token. It was not a feather. It was a sharp, black, freshly napped piece of obsidian, an arrowhead. The agreement was made. Nikan finally, slowly, stood. He was a tall man, and his presence filled the lodge, pushing the very shadows into the corners. He looked down at Elior, and his eyes were as bright as the obsidian. "The man who poisons the water in the valley," Nikan said, his voice a low rumble, "will soon believe he owns the springs in the mountain. The man who puts a child's doll in the street will soon put his fences on our hunting grounds. This sickness must be met." He looked at his council. "But this will not be war. We will not give this man the battle he craves. We will not stain our hands with the blood of fools." He turned back to Elior. "This will be a presence. It will be a mirror, held up to the face of the town. We will ride to his door, not to burn it, but to force the truth to stand up on its own feet. We will be the witness that cannot be bought." The word went out from the lodge. A single drumbeat, low and steady, rolled through the valley. The camp, which had been a place of domestic peace, transformed. It became a place of quiet, intense, and solemn purpose. That night, signals were sent. Torches flared on the high peaks, winking answers to each other across the dark. A new constellation of fire and resolve. Messengers rode out on lean, fast ponies, carrying Nikan's word to the allied bands in the farther valleys. And the preparations began. There were no war cries. There was only the sound, the steady, rhythmic shing, shing, shing of wet stones on spearheads, not sharpening them for blood, but polishing them to a high, bright gleam to catch the morning sun. The sound of medicine bags being filled, women packing dried herbs and bandages. The horse herds were brought down from the high pastures, and the women began to braid. They did not use the red-painted leather of war. They used thin, strong strands of dyed yarn, a color as deep and pure as the high country sky. Blue, the color of clean, running water, the color of justice. They wove them into the manes and tails of the mustangs, 1,000 small, bright flags of purpose. The week passed, the week Elior had promised Juniper. On the dawn of the 7th day, the dawn that was now breaking over Pike's house, the riders gathered. They met in the Hollow of Echoes, a vast, volcanic basin shielded from the wind. The light was gray and cold. The riders filtered in, band by band, silent as the fog. Loontrack's men, Cedar Step's riders, Flint Hollow's, they formed a great crescent-shaped mass, horsemen and horses breathing plumes of white steam into the air. Elior sat his horse beside Nikan, the leather braid a familiar tightness on his wrist. He looked back at the army he had summoned. 300 riders, their faces set, their polished spear tips and the 1,000 blue braids in their horses' manes catching the first, weak light of the day. Nikan looked at the pale line of the east. He looked at Elior. "They are ready," Nikan said, his voice cutting through the cold. "They are ready to ride without firing a single shot." He raised his hand, held it for a beat in the silver air, and then swept it forward. The great silent army moved as one, a river of justice beginning its slow, unstoppable flow down the mountain. They did not take the main pass. Nikan knew Pike would have a man on the Cinder Creek Pass, a man with a long glass, waiting for the smoke of a war party. They were not a war party. Instead, Nikan led them down the Salt Finch Trail, a path unused for a generation. It was a winding, treacherous cut through the salt cedars and alkali flats, a route that followed a dry riverbed and offered no line of sight to the valley below. The sound of their advance was not the thunder of a cavalry charge. It was the sound of a great, moving river. 300 horses, some shod, some unshod, moving at a steady, deliberate walk over the damp, alkali-crusted earth. The sound was a soft, rhythmic, shuffling thud, a sound that the mist absorbed, a sound like a steady, insistent rain falling on dry ground. It was the sound of inevitability. They rode in columns of 4, Elior and Nikon at their head. The air was gray and bitingly cold. As they neared the edge of the lowlands, the scout, Oro, materialized from the mist on their flank. He rode without a sound, his horse breathing in steady, matched time with Elior's. Oro held out a single, rolled piece of tanned hide. Elior took it. He unrolled it as he rode, the stiff leather crackling in the cold. It was the Declaration. It was written in 2 columns. On the left, in the deep blue-black ink of berry dye, was a series of symbols, the elegant, flowing script of Nikon's people. On the right, in clear, concise English, were the terms. It was not a demand for surrender. It was a list of corrections. It demanded, first, a full and public confession from Bartholomew Pike, Rufus Lyle, and Chet Danner for the conspiracy to defraud the territory through illegal fees and price fixing. It demanded, second, full monetary restitution to every rancher and merchant forced into the grain monopoly, the funds to be placed in a public trust administered by the town. It demanded, third, the immediate and permanent dissolution of the exclusive freight and granary contracts, opening the valley to free and fair trade. It was not a weapon of war. It was a legal instrument, backed by a moral weight that now sat 30 score strong on horseback. Nikon rode close, his eyes fixed on the gray line of the horizon, where Pike's property lay. He saw Elior reading the terms, his face grim in the faint light. "The paper is the truth," Nikon said, his voice a low rumble, never rising above the sound of the hoof falls. "But truth is a small, quiet thing. The valley has been deafened by that man's noise. Our presence is the silence that will make them listen." He looked at Elior. "We are the mirror, Nutata. We ride to his house not to burn it, but to hold up a mirror so large that the entire town must see its own face. Every movement must be slow. Every movement must be steady. They will expect war. We will give them justice. Let them see their own fear in our calm." Elior nodded, rolling the hide and tucking it securely inside his coat. The ride was long. The tension was a living thing, a cold snake in his gut. His mind, now that the plan was in motion, was free to be terrified, not for himself, but for her. He wondered where Juniper was. Had she succeeded? Had she, in the dark of the last few nights, found a way into Pike's safe? Had she retrieved the real ledger, or had she been caught? The thought of her, alone in that saloon, in the hands of Rufus or Chet, was a more profound terror than the 300 men at his back could ever counter. His hand, which held the rein, was shaking slightly. It was not the cold. He flexed his fingers, and his knuckles brushed the hard, tight knot of the leather braid she had tied around his wrist. He consciously released the rein with his right hand, and, under the cover of his saddle horn, his fingers found the braid. He gripped it. He felt the tight weave of the leather, a tangible link to her courage. He felt the raised, hard lines of the old scar beneath it. The 2 promises, one of blood and one of home, bound together on his pulse. The shaking stopped. The cold in his gut solidified, from fear into a hard, cold resolve. He would not fail her. He would not fail the mirror. They cleared the last line of salt cedars. The land opened up, and the mist, as if on cue, began to thin. There it was. Pike's ranch. The house was a white, arrogant fortress in the center of the plain. Nikon did not shout an order. He did not have to. He gave a single, fluid signal with his left hand, and the column, the river, began to divide. It was a beautiful and terrible thing to see. The riders on the left peeled away, flowing in a wide, silent arc toward the western fence line, past the bunkhouse. The riders on the right veered east, sealing the perimeter of the stables and the main road. They did not charge. They flowed. A great, silent crescent of horsemen, their polished spear tips and the blue braids in their horses' manes catching the first watery rays of the dawn. They formed a vast, two-horned line, an embrace that was also a trap. They did not block the road to the house. They left a wide, clear path from the veranda straight to the center of town. They were leaving the way open for the truth to walk. The first sound from the house was a shout, a curse of disbelief. The main door of the bunkhouse burst open, and 3 of Pike's hired men spilled out, rifles in hand. They stopped, frozen, seeing the line of riders that stretched for half a mile, enclosing them. Then, the main veranda door of the big house crashed open. It was not Pike. It was Chet Danner and 2 other men, their faces white with panic. They were not carrying rifles. They were rolling something heavy and black, the Gatling gun. It was Pike's ultimate answer, the symbol of his power, the final, mechanical argument against any man who challenged him. They wrestled it to the top of the veranda steps, its brass fittings and multiple barrels gleaming with a dull, oily menace. They swiveled it, aiming its black, clustered mouth directly at the center of the line, directly at Nikan and Elior. This was the moment, the pivot. The entire fragile plan rested on this single second. Elior's horse sensed the threat, tossing its head, its body tensing to wheel and bolt. Elior's own hand instinctively dropped to the pistol on his hip. Nikan did not move. He did not blink. He did not reach for the rifle on his saddle, nor the knife on his hip. He simply sat his horse, his hands resting on the pommel, and stared. He did not look at Pike, who had just emerged onto the porch. He looked past him, at the man crouched behind the Gatling gun, the man whose hand was on the firing crank. Nikan's gaze was not one of hatred. It was not one of anger. It was a look of profound, ancient, and patient clarity. It was the look of a mountain staring at a frantic, noisy rock slide. His eyes said, "Do it. Be the man. Be the one who starts the slaughter. Be the one who pulls that crank and paints this ground with the blood of 300 men who have not raised a hand to you. Do it, and live with the echo of it for all the days of your life." The gunner met that stare. His knuckles were white on the crank. He looked at the silent, unmoving army. He looked at the spears that were held at rest, not aimed. He looked at the utter calm on the faces of the riders, and he realized, with a sudden, drenching cold, that they were not attacking. They were waiting. He looked back at Pike, his face a mask of sudden confusion and terror. He slowly, very slowly, took his hand away from the crank. The tension broke. The first battle was over, and not a single shot had been fired. Bartholomew Pike, standing on his porch in his silk dressing gown, saw his ultimate weapon neutralized by a single, silent look. He watched Rufus Lyle, whose face was now slick with a cold, greasy sweat. He saw Chet Danner, whose hand was trembling so badly he could not have drawn his pistol if he had tried. And in that moment, Pike understood. This was not a raid. This was not a war. This was not a fight for cattle or land. The silence of the army, the formal half-circle, the open path, the lack of a single war cry. It was not an attack. It was a summons. This was a courtroom, set under the vast, gray, impartial sky. And he was the one on trial. Elior McRae urged his horse forward. Nikan moved with him, a pace behind, his shadow. They rode into the empty space, the 50 yards of packed earth between the line of riders and the veranda. They stopped directly in front of the steps, in front of the useless Gatling gun, in front of the man who had buried his honor in a trough. Elior was no longer the dripping boy. He was a man made of cold iron and patient purpose. He looked up at Bartholomew Pike. His voice was not a shout, but it was clear, and it carried in the thin, cold air, sharp as a razor. "There will be a bloodless path forward. Mr. Pike," Elior said. "It is a path that does not cross a single grave, but it requires you to stand in the light." Pike's mouth opened, a dry, rasping sound coming out, but no words. And then, another sound. It came from the town, a mile away, faint, then clear. carried on the cold wind. A single, metallic clang. A pause. Clang. It was the church bell. It was not the frantic, fast ringing of an alarm. It was a slow, steady, solemn toll. A summons. Elior looked toward the town. On the main road, the one left open, the first figures were appearing. Townsfolk, drawn by the impossible sight, summoned by the bell. They were walking, a few at first, then a dozen, then a crowd. The jury was arriving. The bell had stopped ringing, but the sound hung in the air. A metallic, vibrating silence that clamped down on Red Butte Crossing. The main street was no longer a place of commerce. It was a courtroom, and the sky was its ceiling. The 300 riders had moved with the dawn. They were no longer a crescent at Pike's Ranch. They were a wall. They had reformed into two long, impassive lines that blocked the north and south ends of the street. They were the bars of the cage, trapped between them. The entire population of the town had gathered, drawn by the bell and the impossible sight of Bartholomew Pike walking, disarmed, his head bowed, flanked by Elior McRae and a man who looked like he had been carved from the mountain. The townsfolk were silent. They packed the boardwalks, their faces pale and taut. They stood in the doorways of the shops Pike owned, of the bank that held their debts. They saw the Gatling gun, now roped and useless in the back of a wagon, a symbol of its owner's impotence. In the center of the street, not 10 yards from the very trough where Elior had been drowned, a simple table had been set. Elior dismounted. Nicken sat his horse, a silent, powerful observer. Elior walked into the center of the space, his boots kicking up dust. He looked at the faces. He saw Mr. Abernathy from the dry goods store, his hands twisting his apron. He saw Tully, the butcher, his eyes wide. He saw Deputy Harlan, trying to blend into the shadow of the sheriff's office, his badge a piece of dull, shameful tin. Elior's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a clean knife. "You all watched," he said, his voice level. "You watched me in the mud. You watched when my cattle were stolen for $6 a head. You looked away when Sarah Polly's belongings were thrown in this very street. For years, you have been silent. Today, the silence ends." He turned to the 3 men standing exposed by the table, Pike, Rufus, and Chet. They were breathing too fast, their eyes darting from the crowd to the riders, seeking an escape that did not exist. "You will confess," Elior stated. It was not a request. "You will tell them, all of them, what you have done. You will name your crimes, one by one. And then, you will sign the deed of correction." Bartholomew Pike, even in his ruin, had a spark of his old arrogance. He gave a wet, choked laugh. "Confess on what grounds you have no proof. You have an army of savages, but you have no proof. It's my word against a rootless pups." "He has proof, Mr. Pike." The voice came from the boardwalk. It was not a man's voice. It was clear, though it trembled. And it came from the porch of the Red Garter Saloon. Every head in the street turned. There she was, Juniper Vale. She was standing at the top of the saloon steps, the very place where she sang for the men who were now her prisoners. She was pale, so pale she looked like a porcelain doll. And she was shaking, a fine, visible tremor in her hands. But her chin was high, and her eyes were fixed on Pike like 2 burning coals. In her shaking hands, she held it. Not the copied pages. She held the master ledger, the thick, heavy, leather-bound book that held every secret, every bribe, every drop of ink that had bled the valley dry. Pike's face, which had been flushed with bluster, collapsed. The blood drained from it, leaving a sick, gray, papery look. Rufus let out a low, vicious curse. Chet just closed his eyes. Juniper walked down the steps. The sound of her small boots on the wooden stairs was the only sound in the world. She did not look at Elior. She did not dare. She walked with a stiff, terrified determination into the center of the street and placed the heavy ledger on the table with a solid, definitive thud. "Read it," Elior said to Pike. Pike stared at the book as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "No." Nicken, from his horse, moved. He did not dismount. His horse simply took 2 steps forward. The sound of its hooves on the hardpan was like a drumbeat. The animal's head was high, its eyes wild, and it loomed over Pike, a shadow of pure, physical intimidation. Pike flinched back, stumbling. "Read," Elior said again. Pike's shaking hand opened the book. He knew the page. His eyes, frantic, scanned his own neat, damning handwriting. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the crowd, begging for an ally. He found none. He found only 100 pairs of eyes, hungry, cold, and no longer afraid. He licked his dry, cracked lips. His voice was a dry rasp. "Partnership agreement," he read, his voice choking. "The Red Butte Granary. Partners. Bartholomew Pike, Rufus Lyle, Chet Danner." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "Terms," Pike continued, his voice cracking. "All grain purchased within the territory to be sold exclusively to the granary. Purchase price, market value, minus 40%. A gasp. A single sharp intake of breath from a dozen ranchers in the crowd. 40%. It was their blood. "Read the next page," Elior commanded. Pike's hand trembled as he turned it. Freight contract, Double Star Freight Company. All inbound and outbound transport. Subject to a security fee of $10 per wagon. $10, a woman shouted from the crowd. "That's what he charged me for my seed." "Read the retainer," Elior said, his voice like ice. Pike's eyes squeezed shut. "Legal. Retainer. Judge J. Harlan. $50. Monthly." Deputy Harlan, by the jailhouse, seemed to shrink, trying to press himself into the wood of the wall. The crowd turned on him, their faces a mask of unified contempt. He was a dead man, and he knew it. He told me," a voice suddenly sobbed from the crowd. It was Abernathy, the dry goods owner. He stumbled forward, his face a mess of tears and snot, his apron twisted in his fists. "He made me." Abernathy pointed a shaking finger at Pike. "He gave me capital. He called it a loan, but I had to charge the extra 10% on flour. He said he'd call my note. My wife, she's ill. I did it. I took the money. I'm the one who charged Sarah Polly $12 for her flour, God forgive me. I did it." The confession shattered the silence. It was the crack in the dam. The crowd, which had been a collection of silent, individual victims, now saw their own faces in Abernathy's. They were all complicit. Their fear, their silence, had been the mortar in Pike's walls. "He forced me to sell my water rights," another man yelled. "His men broke my fence and ran my cattle. He foreclosed on my brother." The noise became a roar, an avalanche of stored-up rage and shame. Pike stumbled back, his hands raised, as if he could physically ward off the hatred that was now pouring toward him. Elior let the noise build, let it swell, let it become a single, unified wave. Then he raised his hand. Instantly, the 300 riders at the ends of the street raised their lances as one. The polished steel tips flashed in the morning sun. The crowd, seeing the sudden unified movement, fell silent, the echo of their rage dying in the street. "We are not here for his blood," Elior said into the ringing silence. The crowd murmured, some disappointed. "Blood is his answer. It is not ours. We are here for justice." "And justice," he said, looking at Pike, "is the sound of things being made whole again." He stepped toward Pike, his voice rising. Every man and woman in the street leaning in to hear. "First," Elior declared, "the monopoly is broken. As of this moment, the Double Star Freight contract is null and void. The road is free." A tentative cheer began, and grew. "Second," he continued, "the Red Butte Granary is dissolved. You will sell your grain to whomever you please, for whatever price you can fairly get." The cheer was louder now, a sound of profound relief. "Third," Elior called out, the water in the North Spur Canal will be restored. It does not belong to one man. It will be diverted, as it was intended, to the small holdings and ranches it was meant to feed. This was it. This was life. The roar from the crowd was a physical thing, a wave of sound that hit Pike and made him stagger. Nikan urged his horse forward, stopping beside Elior. He, too, looked at Pike, but his voice was for the whole valley. "You have taken from the land," Nikan said, his voice a low, resonant bass. "Now you will give back the hills." He gestured to the north. "That you call the Shadow Verge, the land that touches our hunting grounds. You will cede it. It no longer belongs to you. It will be given to this man, Elior McRae. It will be a buffer, a place of peace, a promise that your sickness will not creep into the high country again." Elior looked at Nikan, stunned. This was not part of their agreement. It was a gift, a sign of permanent, public alliance. Elior nodded, accepting. He turned his attention, finally, to the two men who had stood beside Pike, the two men whose hands were covered in the filth of the trough. Rufus Lyle, Chet Danner. The two men tensed. "Your names are on these contracts. Your hands did the work. Your time in this valley is over. You will take your horses. You will take your saddles. You will take nothing else. You will be gone by sundown." Elior's voice dropped, and the cold in it was absolute. "If you are ever seen in this territory again, if any scout from the high country even sees your trail, you will not be brought back to this town. You will face the judgment of the allied tribes. And their judgment," he added, looking at the stone-faced riders, "is far harder than mine." Rufus's face was purple with rage, his hand twitching for a gun that was no longer there. Chet just looked broken, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Two of Nikan's largest riders dismounted, their movements fluid, and grabbed the two men by the arms. They were marched away, through the crowd, which parted for them with hisses and muttered curses. It was done. Only Pike remained, alone, shaking. His arrogance and his empire turned to dust in a single morning. Elior walked to the table. He moved the ledger of lies aside. He unrolled the stiff hide he had carried from the mountain, the deed of correction. He placed it in the center of the table. From his own coat, he produced a small glass bottle of ink and a clean steel-nibbed pen. He opened the ink, dipped the pen, and held it out to Pike. Bartholomew Pike stared at the pen. He looked at the 300 silent riders. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, their eyes cold and hard and filled with a contempt that was worse than any hatred. He looked at the woman on the saloon porch, the schoolteacher who had undone him. He looked at the young rancher he had tried to destroy. He was beaten. He was utterly, completely, and publicly broken. His hand, the same hand that had cut Elior's hat, that had spat on his brand, was shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. He took it. The pen wobbled in his grip. He bent over the table. He signed. The name was a jagged, spidery scratch. The ink was black, a stain of defeat on the clean hide. As he wrote, a woman in the crowd, Mrs. Abernathy, began to cry. Soft sounds of pure relief. Tully the butcher put his hand on his son's shoulder, his back straight for the first time in memory. Pike dropped the pen. The ink spattered. It was finished. The darkness, the thick, choking, silent shadow that had lived in the town's heart for a decade, had finally been pulled out. It was trapped, black and wet, on a piece of hide. The following day, the wind had changed. It was no longer the cold, mean-spirited wind of judgment. A warm Chinook was blowing down from the high country, and it carried on it the sharp, clean, healing scent of crushed sagebrush and melting snow. Elior and Juniper stood on the crest of the Shadow Verge. It was their land now, this long, high ridge of pinon and rock that Nikan had given them. It was a strange and powerful feeling, to stand on a hill and know it was a shield, a gift, a promise. From here, they could see the whole valley spread out below them, a map of their new world. The town of Dry Comet looked small, almost peaceful, the lines of its streets clean in the afternoon light, and they could see the water, far below, where the North Spur Canal had once been a ribbon of dry, cracked mud. A dark, silver line now moved. It was flowing. The ditch riders, organized by Elior that morning, had already opened the head gates. The water, Pike's hoarded, stagnant water, was free. It was running back into the parched irrigation ditches of the small farms, the ones Pike had tried to strangle. Down in the town square, they could see the trough. It was surrounded, not by jeering men, but by children, splashing and laughing. Someone had scrubbed it clean. Elior's gaze was fixed on that flowing water. He had not slept. None of them had. The night had been spent securing the town. Posting guards, not Niken's men, but the townsfolk themselves, Abernathy and Tully and the others, armed and taking responsibility for their own streets for the first time. Pike was a prisoner in his own house, his wealth a useless pile of paper, his power a ghost. "It's done," Elior said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Juniper, standing beside him, slipped her hand into his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's begun." He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, the smudge of ink still on her cheek from where she had helped draft the new charters all night. He nodded. They went back down into the town. The atmosphere was not one of celebration. It was not a party. It was something more profound. It was the feeling of a long fever finally breaking. The town was quiet, but it was a busy quiet. The silence of work, of purpose, of rebuilding. They walked to the Red Butte granary. The massive, looming building that had been Pike's fist was now surrounded by the very ranchers he had tried to break. Elior walked to the heavy plank door. He held up the large, iron key he had taken from Pike's office. He did not give it to one man. He held it out, and Tully, the butcher, and Abernathy, the storekeep, and Sarah Polly, the widow, all placed their hands on it together. "It's yours," Elior said. "All of you. It's the Dry Comet Farmers Cooperative now. You will set the price. You will share the profit. You will feed this town." They took the key. Sarah Polly's hand was shaking, but her eyes were dry and fierce. It was the sound of the heavy lock turning, the sound of the big doors groaning open. That was the real sound of victory. Juniper stepped up onto a wagon bed, the new charter in her hand, the one she and Elior had written on the back of Pike's useless freight contracts. Her voice, the same voice that had been forced to sing for Pike's pleasure, was now strong and clear, reading for the whole street to hear. "The Fair Price Covenant," she read. "No citizen of this territory shall be denied access to food or water. No man shall hold a monopoly on the earth's bounty. A price shall be set by common agreement, a price that allows a man to sell his labor with dignity and another to buy his bread with honor." She read every line, and with every line, the shoulders of the men and women listening seemed to straighten. They were not just free from Pike, they were binding themselves to each other, to something better. Late in the afternoon, the last act was completed. Chief Niken and a small honor guard of 20 riders, including Oro, came down from the verge. They did not ride into town. They met Elior at the new boundary line, where his father's old, faded fence met the wild land. Niken dismounted. Elior walked to meet him. The two men stood for a long moment, the wind blowing the manes of the horses, the sound of the new flowing water a faint murmur on the air. Niken's eyes were bright. He looked at Elior, at the man who had been the boy at the flood. "The old debt," Niken said, his voice a low rumble, "is paid. The water has been returned." Elior nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "But kinship," Niken continued, a rare, faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, "remains. You are Nutata. You are a brother. This land," he gestured to the hills, "is your shield. Our scouts will be your eyes. The man who tries to cross this line with a dark heart will answer to us both." He did not offer a handshake. He stepped forward and grasped Elior's shoulder, his grip like iron. Elior, his heart overflowing, returned the clasp, gripping the older man's shoulder. It was an embrace between two worlds, a promise sealed in muscle and bone, needing no other words. Niken and his riders turned, and in a cloud of dust and the jingle of bridles, they were gone, flowing back up into the high country, Elior stood alone, watching them go. He felt the rough leather braid on his wrist, Juniper's braid, covering Nikan's scar. He was not rootless. He was the man who stood between. He walked back to his cabin. He was so tired he was swaying, his bones aching with the release of a week of tension. When he opened the door, he stopped. The main room was the same, but the small, dark storage room off the side, the one with the cracked wall, was gone. The wall itself had been knocked out. In its place, rough-hewn pine, smelling of fresh sap and sawdust, framed a new space. It was a kitchen. It was not finished. The walls were still bare studs. The floor was just planks. But in the center of the new, west-facing wall, a large, square hole had been cut, perfectly framing the setting sun, the window he had promised. Juniper was standing in the middle of it, a hammer in her hand. She was covered in sawdust. "I found your father's tools," she said, a little breathlessly, a flush on her cheeks. And the lumber he had stacked behind the barn. I hope you don't mind." He could not speak. He walked past her, into the new space. He ran his hand over the raw, splintered wood of the window frame. He looked at her, at the sawdust in her dark hair, at the blisters forming on her hands. "You did this?" he whispered. "We did," she said. She was standing in the center of the room, looking at the floor, suddenly shy, and then, so softly he almost missed it, she began to hum. It was a simple, wandering tune, a melody with no words. He watched her. She closed her eyes, and the hum became a song. She sang, her voice no longer the loud, projecting instrument of the saloon, but something small and private and clear as a bell. It was a song about planting a garden, a simple, hopeful tune. The sound of it, in that raw, unfinished room, was the warmest thing he had ever felt. It was, he thought, the sound of cornmeal blooming in a hot iron pan. It was the sound of a home. When the song finished, she opened her eyes. He was standing right in front of him, his face etched with an emotion she had never seen. "Elior," she breathed. He reached up, his hand, calloused and rough, touching her cheek. He gently wiped a smudge of sawdust from her skin. "You're safe," he whispered, as if saying it to himself. "You're safe." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "We're safe," she corrected, her own hand coming up to cover his, pressing his palm against her face. He looked at her, at the fierce, brave, impossible woman who had walked into the dark for him, who had faced down Pike with a ledger, who had built his promise with her own hands. He bent his head. His other hand went to her waist, pulling her gently toward him. There was no desperation, no urgency, no rain. There was only the warm, pine-scented air and the low, golden light. He kissed her. It was as deep as the promise, as profound as the trust they had forged. It was a kiss of absolute gratitude, of a shared, bone-deep relief. Their breath mingled, becoming one, a slow, shared sigh. His hand moved from her waist, sliding up her back, his fingers spreading wide over her shoulder blades, feeling the strong, steady beat of her heart through the thin fabric of her dress. Her hand left his cheek and slid to his chest, her fingers curling into the rough flannel of his shirt. Holding on, it was a slow, respectful, reverent exploration, a kiss that was a long, silent conversation. There was no fear, no doubt. They were two people who had seen the absolute worst of their world and had found, in each other, the anchor for a new one. Their eyes were closed, locked in a trust that was more complete than any vow. They broke apart, but did not separate, resting their foreheads together. He was breathing hard, as if he had run a mile. He held her, his face buried in her sawdust-scented hair. He whispered, the words a rumble against her temple. The dream he had not dared to have. "I can see it," he murmured. "I can see the cattle, fat and sleek, grazing on the verge. I can see a herd, a real herd, and a schoolroom. In the fall, with a big window, a window as big as this one." She pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were shining in the low light, not with tears, but with the same fierce strength that had brought them here. She smiled, a slow, certain smile that lit her entire face. "We will," she said. Outside, in the last light of the day, a group of children, Sarah Polly's daughter among them, ran laughing through the yard, chasing the late-season butterflies. They ran past the trough, the one Elior's father had built, without a second glance. It was just a trough again, a place for horses to drink, its memory of humiliation washed clean by the sound of new water. As the sun touched the horizon, a single rider appeared on the ridge of the shadow verge. It was Oro. He dismounted, and in the twilight, they watched him drive a stake into the ground, at the very crest. He placed a heavy, flat stone against it, a stone carved with the clean, deep lines of a river otter. It was not a fence, it was a boundary stone, a marker of a new, sacred, and unbreakable alliance. The last brilliant orange ray of the sun cut through the new, empty window frame, painting a perfect golden square on the far wall of the kitchen. Elior took Juniper's hand, her small, blistered, strong hand closed around his. Together, they stood in the frame of their future and watched the beginning of a new era. A week passed. The air in Dry Comet was cleaner, as if the whole valley had taken its first full breath in a decade. The sound of hammers was constant. Men were fixing their own fences, re-roofing their own barns. The farmers' cooperative, working out of the old granary, was a hive of loud, chaotic, and honest argument. The fear was gone, replaced by the difficult, heavy work of freedom. But peace, in the high territories, is often just the moment a man spends reloading. The first sign came, as it always did, from the river. The Cinder Ferry landing, which had seen only local traffic, received a new, strange wagon. It was pulled by two massive Percheron draft horses, animals bred for hauling stone, not for ranch work. The wagon itself was new, its wood unweathered, and the crates it carried were bound in steel. The men who unloaded them were not Pike's men. They were not Rufus and Chet. These men were quiet, dressed in dark, city-cut suits, their hands clean and uncalloused. They worked with a silent, unsettling efficiency. They spoke to no one. On the side of the heavy crates, a stenciled logo was visible, Double Star Freight. It was the name of the company Pike had supposedly crushed, the rival he had driven from the territory 3 years ago. The rumors began in the saloon, which was now run by a town committee headed by a flustered but determined Mr. Abernathy. The men in the dark suits were surveyors. It was said they represented an interest from back east, a group of investors with names no one could pronounce. They were not just bringing goods, they were buying. They were inquiring about Bartholomew Pike's outstanding notes, the ledgers Juniper had seized. The very books that had freed the town were now seen as a commodity. This new, faceless entity wanted to buy the debt, all of it, not to forgive it, but to consolidate it. And the word that was whispered over the bar, a word that was both a promise and a threat, was railroad. A new, private line, one that would bypass the main territorial spur and cut straight through the heart of the valley, right through the shadow verge. Juniper was the first to find the proof. She was in the schoolhouse, which now served as the town's records office by day. She was not a teacher at this moment. She was an accountant, a historian, trying to unravel the tangled knot of Pike's finances to ensure the restitution payments were fair. She was reviewing old invoices from the general store, cross-referencing them with the master ledger. She held a single sheet of paper up to the light of the window, the one that now looked out on children playing freely. It was an invoice from 3 months prior, for a shipment of overpriced, low-quality seed. It was marked, paid in full, but the seal was wrong. It was not Pike's heavy, embossed stamp. It was a cheap, blurry forgery, pressed in common wax. She had seen it before. On other invoices she had dismissed as irrelevant. But now, seeing the Double Star Freight logo on the wagon at the ferry, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She ran her finger over the wax. Pike had not been fighting a rival. He had been working with a partner. This was the seal of a silent associate. a hand that moved goods and money in the shadows, a hand Pike used when he did not want his own name on the transaction. She realized, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that they had not cut the head off the snake. They had merely exposed one of its fangs. The men at the ferry were not rivals. They were the collectors. A new, more patient, and far darker hand was already moving the pieces on the board. Elior felt the change in the land. He was a man of water and earth, and he knew when something was wrong. He was riding the ditch line of the North Spur Canal. The water was flowing, yes, but the pressure was low. The farms at the end of the line, Sarah Polly's included, were getting a trickle, not the full flow they had been promised. He rode the canal all the way up, past his own property, toward the high ground Nikan had given him. He followed the rushing sound, his eyes scanning the banks. He found it a mile below the head gate, tucked into a narrow cut, hidden by willow brush. It was not a dam. It was far more intelligent than that. Someone had driven a long, iron survey pin deep into the canal bed, angled just so, under the surface of the water where no casual rider would see it. It was a subtle, clever piece of sabotage. It was not meant to stop the water, which would have been an obvious act of war. It was designed to divert it. A small, constant stream, perhaps 10% of the total flow, was being shaved off the main current and funneled into a dry, forgotten arroyo that led down into the basin. It was an act of quiet, patient theft. This was not the work of a blunt instrument like Rufus Lyle. This was the work of an engineer. He was kneeling in the mud, his hand on the cold iron, studying the way it split the current, when a pebble clicked on the rocks behind him. He was on his feet, his pistol clear of the holster, in a single motion. Oro stood 20 feet away, as still as the granite around him. The scout's face was impassive, but his eyes were grim. He did not gesture a greeting. "He was here," Elior said, his voice flat, gesturing to the pin. "No," Oro replied, his voice a low whisper that seemed to be part of the wind. "He was already here." Oro moved past him and knelt by the bank. He pointed to a track Elior had missed, a boot print, but not a cowboy's. The heel was narrow, the sole was smooth. "These are not Pike's men. They walk softly. They know the high country." Oro stood, his black eyes meeting Elior's. "There is new gold in the valleys," he said, "more than Pike ever had. Someone is spreading it like seed. They are paying for silence. They are asking questions about the new boundary stones." Oro paused, and his gaze hardened. "They are asking about the man with the watermark on his wrist." The scout was a messenger. He did not stay to discuss. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pressed something small and soft into Elior's hand. Then, like the fog, he was gone, melting back into the pines, heading for the high ridges. That evening, the new kitchen was quiet. The sun was setting, filling the room with the warm, golden light that Elior had promised. The window was paned with real glass, the first purchase made by the Farmers' Cooperative, a gift to the woman who had balanced their books. Juniper was at the table, the forged invoice flat in front of her. Elior stood by the new, cold stove, the iron pin in one hand. He opened his other hand. On his palm lay the object Oro had given him. It was a small tuft of otter fur, but it was not the rich brown of the living animal. It had been dyed with bloodroot, a deep, stark, unsettling red. It was not a call to arms. Not yet. It was a warning. It was the signal that the sacred line had been touched, that the water was in danger. Juniper looked from the false invoice to the iron stake, to the red-dyed fur. She saw the 3 arms of the new enemy, one for the ledgers, one for the land, and one for the alliances. "Pike was a bully," she whispered, her voice thin but not breaking. "He was loud, and he was arrogant. This is a spider. It is smart, and it is quiet, and it was here all along." Elior said nothing for a long time. He looked at the kitchen, at the life they had built in 7 days. He looked at the woman who had been brave enough to build it with him. His gaze fell to his own left wrist. He did not need to touch the scar. His fingers, calloused and sure, found the worn, familiar toughness of the leather braid she had tied there. It was softened now by a week of sweat and water and work, but the knot held. He closed his fist around it. The one solid, unchangeable thing in a world that was already trying to slide back into the dark. He looked up, and his eyes met hers in the golden, failing light. "He bent us," Elior said, his voice quiet, but with the flat, hard certainty of the iron in his other hand. "He did not break us. We will stand straight." He took a deep breath, the smell of fresh pine and setting dust filling his lungs. "We will stand straight again, juniper, if we have to." Up on the shadow verge, the boundary stone Nikan had set stood its ground against the evening wind. The carved otter faced the valley, a silent guardian. The last light of the day struck its quartz-veined surface, casting a shadow that stretched long and deep across the reclaimed land. A shadow like a promise, like an oath that had not expired. In the West, justice is not a fixed thing. It is not a courthouse or a jail or a man with a badge. It is a river, and any man who thinks he can own it, who thinks he can bend it to his will, forgets the nature of water. He forgets the power of the current. You can build a dam, you can dig a ditch, you can hammer a pin to divert its flow, but sooner or later, the water will find its level. The current will sweep your feet from under you, and the flood will wash away the lines you drew in the mud. The sun sets on one fight, but it always rises on the next, and the dawn. It always knows where to find the ones who have chosen to stand straight. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with you. So please, let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and share your thoughts on Elior and Juniper's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And if you want to support us further, please press that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.